Okay, I apologize only a little bit for moving you along quickly, because I want to remind you of one thing. You all want to be here. So we all wanted to come back, and I know it was a short break, but we're going to have a great close to this afternoon. So we're going to have 4 talks, and then we're going to ask all the speakers from this afternoon to come up here, and then we'll see how we can engage in the time we have. So Monika Janitor.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Monika Janitor. I teach art history at the Cluster of Excellence, Asia and Europe in a global context, at the University of Heidelberg. And before I start, I really would like to thank Matthew, despite his curtailed functions in the interest of time, for the gentle care with which he has been ushering us through this very dense conference. In German, one would say mit Herz und Humor. And I also, on a personal note, I'd like to say how pleasant it was, our little group conversation last night, which took us from subjects ranging from the sartorial choices of museum directors to issues of budget and audience, and after that I feel I've known you for years. Okay, thank you also, Marion, for bringing us all together today, and thanks to your wonderful team, Florence, Ute, Noura, for just making this a perfectly organized function. I would also just like to say that I have been associated with this museum now in an advisory capacity for some years. I think it started with Hartwig Fischer's vision for a program that connected Europe with the world, Europawelt, and I was very fortunate after he left. He was succeeded by Marion, who shared the same vision, so we can now look forward. This is just the beginning, you know, of a whole series of events to actually realize this vision. Okay, over these past 2 days, we have heard several contributions, eloquent, impassioned, down to earth, very informative, about the role of encyclopedic museums. So here I come as an art historian and to give my dash of mustard to this discussion. It seems that this kind of museum has never stopped being. We don't have any more of these museums today, and yet it continues to be at the center of discussions, and we notice in this conference also the poles along which the discussion goes. Okay, so on the one hand, there is this whole post-colonial critique about this kind of museums, complicity with colonialism. It's considered today by many as an anachronism, a philosophically untenable model for the 21st century, to paraphrase Tom Flynn, and has therefore generated really ethical issues for the present. And then, on the other hand, you have museums also constantly responding to efforts to reinvent themselves as places that build bridges for cultures, promote cosmopolitan understanding, and they are now, as we heard also in this conference, both not only museums that bring the world together, museums for the world. So these are the 2 poles, and yet beyond these familiar poles, there is another dimension which also came in from time to time here, which complicates our understanding of the issues. And this is what my colleague from Delhi, Kavita Singh, calls a worm's eye view. That is a micro perspective from the locality. So if we shift our scale from these poles of, you know, post-colonial critique and multicultural societies in Europe, and we go down to the individual regions, there's a lot of talk talk about the source societies, here too there is a tangled politics of these individual regions where several kinds of critiques engage with each other. And these point to the fact that not all communities in a given region or locality speak from the same position as the official voice of the nation state. And I think discussions about the museum in Europe cannot be really delinked from this micropolitics of the regions, where the nation state itself manufactures its own versions of the past by privileging certain strands of culture as mainstream, national, and others are relegated to categories such as folk traditions or minority cultures. And so it's, I'm rehearsing these arguments to point out that the issues at stake here are more complex than the simple, almost formulaic opposition between rich and poor nations, between the powerful and the weak, between erstwhile colonizers and colonies, or between secular enlightenment and pre-modern religiosity. Though, our ethical consciousness makes us cling to these issues, we are concerned about these matters, and yet by themselves they're no longer helpful because they have been overlaid today by other more urgent concerns and boundaries that cut through a globalized world and transcend those of individual nation states. So all in all, the embattled claims and counterclaims that cut across scales make us really aware of how fractured our present notions of culture, belonging, and ownership are. But let me focus on the museum itself. As I said, this all-encompassing genre of the encyclopedic museum is hardly feasible to recreate today, unless one of the Gulf states buys up the whole Louvre. But the institution of the museum per se has proved to be remarkably resilient and prolific. I would say that it is not now no longer attached to this parochial origins in Europe. It has traveled across the globe. It has thrived in new localities. It has morphed like an amoeba into these new and unpredictable forms and continues to retain a magnetic aura. And yet this originally and in many ways still canonical incarnation of the museum, the so-called Universal Museum of the 19th century, has not lost its relevance. And even though it's posing a lot of questions, even its most trenchant critics concede that it is a form of a museum that needs to be preserved. So the question is how, and this conference, I think, is a good place to witness some of these discussions. Our discussions are encapsulated into this, what we call complex political times, the catchwords of the present, fundamentalism, xenophobic nationalism, protectionism, migration, citizenship. These are the kind of concerns that form the backdrop. So I want to spell out more concretely how the Universal Museum can respond to some of these concerns. What are the kind of questions we need to ask? Firstly, what are the terms shaping the encounter between the viewer and the objects in the museum? What could these be from what they are right now? And what is the work that such a collection can do to problematize the modernist ontologies that conflate culture with the modern nation state? And finally, what are the premises that would make it possible then for this kind of museum to become a testing ground for a more critical form of globality? And that is why the epistemological query contained in the first part of my title, it addresses these worldviews located in particular knowledges of things that frame what we see. How such knowledge is created, how it congeals into a mode of being, and importantly, in how it is complicit with the genealogies of the discipline we practice. The discipline I'm associated with is art history. It's a discipline that is, undergoing a process of self-reflection, and I wish to argue that this renewal, this self-reflection, cannot be uncoupled from the museum. They're both mutually dependent, they both reinforce each other, and the Universal Museum offers unique possibilities for enabling, I have to keep looking there, and dynamizing this renewal. Now, the discipline of art history, has defined its function as placing an individual work or object within historical time, in this stylistic corpus of relating works, creating thereby a narrative of an evolutionary order of objects and styles, and from which we can absorb then the truth of, extract the truth of cultures, fix these. And these narrative principles bear uncanny resemblance to biological laws. And in tandem with this process, the museum then at the same time became a pedagogical site to fix these histories in this nexus of synchronic and diachronic relationships, carried out through various modes of framing and sequential juxtaposition. So today, if we go back and look at this history, this formative moment of the 19th and the 20th century, we find that both art history and the museum were responding to a globality of that conjuncture. That was a conjuncture when, you have objects coming into Europe from all over regions of the world, archaeological excavations, colonial appropriations, acquisitions, collections, diplomacy, and they all pose these fresh challenges to a discipline that is fixated aesthetically on classical antiquity. So both the museum and art history have world configuring function, and they want to bring all world cultures into one discipline. In German, it was referred to as Weltkunstgeschichte. There's a whole corpus of writing, which I can't go into, but I just, in very telegram style, let me extract what comes out of these. This engagement with cultural difference. Art historians of that time used terms like peoples, nations, Völker, Nationen, and then they brought in things like race, climate, ethnicity, and all these together add up to a notion of culture that is enclosed within the territorial bounds of the nation. And I think the aesthetic domain and cultural production is anchored here, and this has remained the founding premise of much of art history and its equation of art in the modern nation, using Darwinian models of evolution and the concept of style then, which all art historians still adhere to, is a convenient tool to coordinate and stabilize the metamorphosis of forms and objects. And so we have geographical location as self-contained, and which then, and style gets located to that, and this kind of suppresses the plurality and agency and circulation of objects of form. And I'd like to argue that it's this development of the discipline which also informed a lot of museological practice, the kind of labels they give the object, the way the galleries are constructed, this construction of stylistic groups, associating styles with bounded regions, separating them. This resonates a bit, somewhat with the last paper, into these categories of art, ethnological, object, craft, and so on. Now today, the Encyclopedic Museum of all museums is best placed to undo the effects of this separation, given the wide diversity of its collections, and it can do a lot if it is also willing to engage in this process of self-reflection. Again, in telegraphic style, what can the museum do? It can actually make visible and tangible what cosmopolitan exchanges actually were involved. So while we talk of it at a theoretical level, the museum can make this tangible because it can disrupt, if it undertook very different kinds of organizations of its galleries, new criteria for organizing its galleries. It can, undo this conventional and mechanical association between objects and places. It can eschew chronology which becomes teleology. It can also, and this also came up earlier, through the collections, transcend the separation between art and science. In other words, the Universal Museum or the Encyclopedic Museum can make tangible a more capacious notion of culture, not only as constituted through encounters, but also something as being co-produced between the human and the non-human world, and question this division between nature and culture central to the ontologies of modernity. So I won't I have only 5 minutes left. I'm going to cut out. So I was just thinking of certain kinds of arrangements the museums could make, you know, of their galleries into a thematic. One could show, for example, how the creation of the human form and the imagination of the human form was really a very connected, you know, feature that extended over a vast contact zone, extending from Greece to Central Asia, to Bactria, to Gandhara, you know, in present-day Afghanistan and Pakistan, going back to Rome. I'll leave that out. I want to bring in one aspect that came up yesterday in Neil McGregor's talk about how can the museum problematize the issue of religion or religious identity. And it was, you know, articulated through this whole controversy about whether a cross up there is a Christian symbol or not. My answer to that is the museum is probably best placed to create discourses that question the kind of media and political discourses we are constantly confronted with, which again associate, like the way culture is associated with the nation, religion gets tied up to a certain location and place. If we look at world religions like Christianity or Buddhism or Islam, they are no longer attached to their places of origin. Not only have they traveled across the world, there are these processes of acceptance which have made them part of very, very different kinds of subjectivities. We talked yesterday about hospitality and about the kind of hospitality if a guest comes and knocks at your door. Again, these are very, you know, culturally coded responses. When I speak, say, of the, you know, of the Indian context, but when Christianity came knocking at the door, with this claim to having the exclusive truth of the gospel, it underwent all kinds of transformations. I think in Indian languages, you have a word for hospitality which means that you make the guest your own, Aneignung, if you like, you want to translate it into German. And so as a result of this, you know, Christianity today, like in Africa, like in India, is so anchored, it's become part of very different kinds of subjectivities. And I wanted to, and I think works of art, objects, I'll cut off these, this is about the human body, but I don't have time to go to these. I want to show you through objects where Christian themes have actually been, these are pages from a Mughal album of the 16th century. These were the patrons were Muslim rulers, the artists were, some were Muslims, some were Hindus, and who related to a lot of Christian ideas and translated these into various Christian themes. The Last Supper, I don't know how many variants in Indian art you have, the birth of Christ, or the Madonna and the Child, all through history. These are all the 16th century, and here is something from the 20th century of how new subjectivities are formed. So the whole question is is the Christian cross only a European symbol? I think art history and museums can answer this in very different ways. Okay, now to conclude, I want to return to this epithet of the universal that we have more or less discarded and replaced by the encyclopedic to characterize the museum. I'm grateful. Yesterday evening, I think Peggy and I were chatting with Neil, and I sort of mentioned to him, and I said, you know, you should bring back the universal. And he looked at me and he said, you do that, darling. I, as a museum director, will not dare do it. So I am grateful to Peter and for having brought this back, because the term universal, it has been battered by post-structuralist assaults on meta-narratives. It might be worth thinking about a rehabilitation of the concept of the universal, though recalibrated to respond to the the complex times of the present, if you like. Because universal or universalism has never been a static term. Its meanings have shifted over time, especially in relation to collections. The earliest use actually predates the Enlightenment. It goes back to the collections of the 16th and the 17th century, where theorists of collecting, while acknowledging that true universality was unattainable, the idea or the ambition to accumulate as expansively as possible would then serve to evoke vanitas, that is the transitoriness of human activities. In the Enlightenment, its use was similarly marked, and I think this was brought up also in some of the, in NANETTE's talk yesterday. It was marked by this constant awareness of the unsustainability, and this then necessitates, principles of classification and taxonomic separation and fragmentation to discrete collections. Can we retrieve the category today for the museum? And I take my cue here from recent philosophical positions. One example is that articulated by Susan Buck-Morse in her book on Hegel and Haiti. She talks about universal history, and she recasts it by saying that it involves a denationalization of events to reinscribe them as questions of universal concern. In other words, we can interpret universality not as inclusivity, that is pulling everything into the same narrative. We can use it as a method, as a mode of intervention into history. Closer to our domains, curators of contemporary art seem to be working in a similar direction, and I refer, for example, to Ranjit Hoskote, who's located in Mumbai, and who coined the term critical transregionality as an alternative to exhausted cartographies, such as those of the Cold War or the clash of civilizations or the West and the rest. Instead, he speaks of, I quote, continents of affinity. Similarly, the museum could once more aspire to be universal, not by bringing the world under a roof. The universal need today no longer stand for totality or specularity, this was said earlier, nor an ideal of plenitude, but as a new tool to think with, as a step towards liberating location from geography, culture and belonging, from the bounds of the nation state, and build instead a lattice of transregional connections amongst institutions and curators based on a search for commonality in the face of jointly faced crises. And this is a step that is both ethical and aesthetic. And that kind of a universal museum would be a sanctuary not of repose, as James Cuno envisages it, but one of complicity in complex times. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roxley Foley.
Thank you. I'd first like to acknowledge how honoured I am for the invitation to speak here today and to be surrounded by such a collection of world knowledge and heritage. I feel very privileged to be here. I believe I've already been given the distinguished title of he who has travelled the furthest to be here today. But I'm also have the privilege of being the youngest speaker, and also the benefit of speaking to you from a position outside of your institutions, from a viewpoint from the communities on the ground whose collections you hold. This gives me an opportunity to say things that won't run me the risk of losing my job, and I might say a few things that you may not want to hear, but these things need to be said. Now, this isn't actually my first time in Germany. Late last year, I was in Berlin touring the ethnographic collections of the Berlin Ethnographic Museum. I happened to be in Berlin at the time that Donald Trump was elected. Now, I normally wouldn't give the time of day to the orange buffoon, but I think it was important for us who are fond of history and historical dates that we acknowledge the fact that the day that Trump was elected was also the same day that the Berlin Wall first came down. And there's an extreme irony that a man who was elected on a promise to put a new wall up came to power at that day. And I think the old adage of those who don't learn from history are destined to repeat the same mistakes. And indeed those, if I may add to that, those of us who have an understanding of history and a voice, if we don't do something about it, will be destined to watch those same mistakes play out again and again. So we're here to talk in part about how our cultural institutions can counter the return of nationalism and fascism in Europe. However, I feel compelled to remind people that for some of us, it has never truly left. Australia, when it joined the world stage as a federated nation, was born in an act of white supremacy. Its first law enacted was the White Australia policy, produced by the belief that Britain had become too polluted by its colonies and that Australia could be a bastion of purity in a world of mongrels. Even Europe at this time was considered dirty white and were barred entry through labyrinthine, bureaucratic language tests that weren't counted into the days after the World Wars, where, to counter the prejudice that refugees were facing, a program named the Beautiful Balts brought Baltic women to Australia to be sold in what can only be described as sexual servitude to farmers. Now, for whatever white Australia viewed Europeans, it was nothing compared to how my people were viewed. My people hold the living memory of an unyielding genocide. The fact that I'm here at all to tell this story is a testament of our resistance, our determination and our commitment to keep the historical record against all odds. We have survived massacres, concentration camps, and the longest-running eugenics program of assimilation ever conducted by a nation. A program that, I might remind you, started before the Great Wars of Europe, continued during, and still exists today under new euphemisms of development theory. The reserves and concentration camps are gone, but we are now the most imprisoned people on the planet, often held in all Aboriginal privatised super prisons, or as they call them now, culturally appropriate facilities. We're still forcibly removed from our lands to make way for natural resource extractors. In fact, the entire architecture of Indigenous and social welfare in the policy is currently designed by a mining magnate whose entire family fortune was founded on the Aboriginal slave trade. Our children are still taken in greater numbers today than the days of the stolen generations, no longer by the protection boards, but by the Departments of Children and Family Services. We live in fear of the very institutions that are supposed to protect and serve us. When this history is not understood, the state is enabled to carry on its program unchallenged, and we are blamed for our own poverty and trauma born of our dispossession, slavery and murder. But we are here to talk about Europe, so again I feel compelled to remind you all that Australia's crimes do not just affect my people. Apartheid policy was born in the sugar plantations of Queensland and exported to South Africa. The eugenic studies of Melbourne University in Victoria provided the foundations and justifications that were used by many Nazi Party scientists. Well known is the escape of Nazis to South America. Lesser known is their escape and support in Australia. Even today in modern times, current Australian refugee policy provides the ability for European countries to take a harder line stance because Australia is not called into question. And today, American spy bases like Pine Gap allow the drone control that currently bombards Pakistan and Afghanistan. I tell you this because despite the world's love and fascination with my people's culture, art and history, when I travel the world and see our collections in galleries and museums, our story is divorced from our struggle. The appropriation and promotion of our art hides the crimes perpetrated on my people. We are not dead. we're a living culture struggling for survival and recognition. I do not want to see my peoples relegated to a museum shelf and to the pages of history. If our story is not told at home, where our history continues to be political, we must ensure that the truth be told across the world. Now, despite the fact of what I've just said, I'm not here to give you a lecture. I'm here to make this real for you, that this is not something that's just happening, it's something that we live through every day. I want to make a call to action. Our cultural institutions are our last bastion that provide us our self-reflection of ourselves and understanding of each other, and in many cases across our international borders, provide the protection of historical revisionism in our own states. As much as we seek your assistance, we have a lot to offer. In Australia, we have some of the greatest stories untold. The stories of the frontier wars and the colonisation of Australia are equally enthralling of anything you might find across the Americas or the colonisations of any other country. They're stories of epic resistance. We never laid down and we never stopped fighting. And then our modern day stories tell a story of creativity, how we took on the stories of resistance of the rest of the world and how we altered them and made them relevant to our people, and how we continuously learned from each other. How we moved away from, we didn't use violence, we used art, we used humour, we used our understanding of our common humanity, because we knew after such subjugation and being only 3% of a population, we can only rely on that understanding of everybody to make sure that our messages are heard. In fact, most people won't realise that a lot of our collections are based in Europe. Most people, when they think of the colonisation of Australia, they think of the UK. But because our very humanity was a question of politics, the country of Australia being founded under a law terra nullius, which meant land of no people, we were denied treaties. We were denied the very acknowledgement of our humanity. Not a single anthropology department in Australia studied my people until after the 1970s, when we were finally given our acknowledgement of humanity. Consequently, many of the collections of our artefacts and our human remains remain in the vaults of Europe. Germany, in particular, provides us a foothold where we can reinvigorate this conversation. Due to the wartime losses, a lot of the catalogues of what you have in your vaults have been lost. So we're here to alleviate the fear you have. Don't be afraid of us. We're not here to clean out your vaults. We don't want your axe heads and your random spears. We want you to help you understand what you have. Because without this knowledge, you've been relying on white anthropologists' interpretations, which quite often aren't peer-reviewed because there are not enough people to question these narratives that have so long gone unchallenged. And in this process, we need to make sure that we develop these relationships in a field of respect and equal terms of power. When I say the need to bring home remains, I believe our previous colleague made mention there are thousands of our ancestors in these vaults, and as long as there's a market for these bones, we still experience modern-day grave robbing of our relatives that we bury today. This needs to come to an end. But by breaking these Western narratives of noble savagery, we stand to discover new ways of ecological and democratic systems that can bring a lot of healing. It is our differences of the human experience that provide us the great unifier and helps us understand that none of us have all the answers. It's only together that we're going to solve the problems that face us. But how do we achieve this? And I guess in many ways, I'm already speaking to I'm speaking to the converted. I see many people of courage and vision in the audience, and maybe even a little bit of subversiveness. And I say to you that we need to work together. Already in the first days, we've heard some fantastic ideas. We've heard ideas about our institutions becoming lending institutions, where if we forgo the power and ownership of these objects, we can stop encyclopedic museums just being a place for tourists to visit. We need to make sure that these cultural institutions are first and foremostly for the people, because that's where they can do the most good. By lending our objects, we provide a fluidity of collections that mean you don't just visit the museum and say that I don't need to come back for 5, 10 years because it's the same thing that we've seen. We bring an evolution of the collections. And this doesn't mean we have a homogenized viewpoint or way things are presented. All of our institutions have a different way of presenting, a unique viewpoint, a different story to tell. We've heard stories of providing multiple narratives. I find it amazing that institutions like this can hold collections of the entire world, but there's only room for one description or one story of an object. If we combine modern-day digital technology, we can move to a point where people are allowed to go as far down the rabbit hole as they may choose. If they want to just view the object and its intrinsic aesthetic value, that's fine. But through simple QR codes, we have the entire freedom of information at our fingertips. So the same person could see that object again and again and learn more and more stories. And this is also important, as mentioned before, you have to have both those sides of the story. The truth is somewhere in the middle, and we have to have respect of the people to have that critical thinking and to have that understanding for themselves. We can't lessen ourselves to the lowest common denominator. More importantly than anything else, it was again mentioned earlier, we need to look outside of Europe for leadership. We constantly talk about breaking the Eurocentric narrative of these institutions, but we don't travel outside Europe to make that difference. And institutions may seem challenging, they may seem monolithic, but they're made up of you. They're made up of the people inside of the institutions. So with that knowledge, we can make change. I couldn't do this work if I didn't believe that people can change and people can make a difference. So I guess to wrap this up, and I'm going to save you a couple of minutes to get back on your time schedule, I really want to reiterate that point that we need to work together, and that at home we don't have the power. And although you may have the power, we need to learn how to break that down. Have trust in the people, have trust in those whose culture is lived and owned by, to be able to tell that narrative and tell that story the best. And I hope in the future, and particularly with the upcoming Humboldt Forum, I hope that we can have a conversation, because I know that with the eyes of Europe faced on this institution, we can help you provide a story that has never been told before, that everybody is going to want to see, and that can help bring the people back to understanding us. We never forgot the world, but the world seems to have forgotten us. And we want to take our stage back on the world with pride and with strength and help this world heal. Thank you.
Don't go away. You're coming back up later. Nanette, shoot.
Yeah, difficult after Siraj Rasool. and ROXLEY FOLEY. Dear participants, you see here on my map, because the title of my intervention, of my lecture, is Museums and Coloniality, from Paris to Herrnhut, and I was sure that maybe some people from this audience has no idea where is Herrnhut. So here you see, from Paris to Herrnhut, you have about 1,000 kilometers, and it is almost 200 hours, I think here 215 hours walk. So, Paris to Herrnhut. I am the director of 3 museums, so here in Dresden, in Leipzig and in Herrnhut. That's why the title in from my lecture. So dear participants, my lecture today is embedded in the topic of museums and coloniality, from Paris to Herrnhut. Although colonization has technically ended for much of the world, coloniality, including lasting effects of colonization, such as racism, discrimination, and the dominance of the monocultural Western perspective, still continues, as we have seen today. As institutions embedded in this history, many ethnographic museums were established in order to commemorate world cultures that were soon to be erased and absorbed into or replaced with the colonizing Western culture. The Encyclopedic Museum has a central mission to show the realities of coloniality, which is, by the way, on all levels existing in our society until here in this room, where mainly all museum directors are coming from the West. The Encyclopedic Museum and the Ethnographic Museum will help to dismantle this. Museums and their objects are haunting us for many years. How are we dealing with this in different places in Europe? And why this unease regarding to those millions of objects created in different times in places over the world is actually never ending? For more than 30 years, millions of artifacts, objects from Africa, Asia, the Americas and the Pacific held in European institutions have haunted the museum field. Curators, scholars, activists, journalists, visitors, and last but not least, the first owners, but mostly non-visitors in European museums. Despite exhibitions, museum renovations, tons of books and other publications, and numerous cooperations with the so-called source societies, the phantom limbs still feel pains. The criticism of a lack of structural provenance research, the so-called in German Provenienzforschung, which becomes by the time a kind of magic solution for all our sorrows, in ethnological collections and the discussions and conflicts regarding the restitution of human bones to their homelands, as well as of colonial war booties and sacred objects, show how great the international pressure is, and under which the ethnographic and or encyclopedic museums in Europe are today. The often postulated multi-perspectivity is rarely reflected in the exhibitions or mediation formats, and the involvement of people from those countries of origin has a minor lasting influence on museum structure and discourse, unlike the Te Papa, for example, in New Zealand, or the Museum of Anthropology in Canada. Shouldn't we stop with the wishful thinking and act now before it is too late? Those exotic objects where we are talking about belong to people who were living in remote places. At the time, otherness was related to elsewhereness, alterity to spatial distance, and Europe was the center of the world. Today, the massive displacement of people from the south to the north and the general interconnection of all societies has detached the former links between places and people. Everywhere today you can find everybody and everything, but really everywhere. and in the museum? And are museums everywhere? Not everywhere you can find those collected objects which are haunting us. There is a folklore, and I would like to have the second slide. Okay, you are there. Thank you. There is a folklore tale in Japan which is going about the tsukumogami, the souls of the tools. It is said in the yin-yang book that more than 100 years old tools get souls. They become animated when they haven't been well treated enough or thrown away. Could we consider our so-called ethnographic objects as tsukumogami who are haunting us? Thank you for Petra, if Petra Martin found those woodblock prints in our collections. Objects from far remote places who are here and not there anymore, and from which the descendants are unable to see them, whereas millions of collected objects are amassed in our stores. People from remote regions, from where the objects are originating, are trying to fly over the sea instead of traveling in the sky by plane, whereas people from those countries are being limited by borders, seas, walls and papers. Yes, an encyclopedic museum, but for whom? For those who have a visa? This is the tragedy of ethnological holdings in Europe. Who are for those who can enjoy them and those who can't? So how to deal with this tragic contradiction? I remember so well the deep moving speech of Aminata Traoré, the poetess and writer and former Minister of Culture in Mali, while opening the Musée du Quai Branly, where I worked for 15 years, in 2006, and I quote her, "Ainsi nos œuvres d'art ont droit de citer là où nous sommes, dans l'ensemble interdit de séjour. Does our works of art have the right to quote where we are generally forbidden to stay?" This was 6 months after the Cité, the suburbs, were in flames in the northern ghettos of Paris, when the youth of the diaspora expressed their despair and anger in a system where coloniality reigns. So how can they stop being institutions and instruments of control, regulation and reproduction of this coloniality? This is the tragic paradox of the museum. He cares for, but also continue a system of power. I must admit, when I almost stumble on the thousands of objects from Africa or other continents in our stores here in Saxony, a region where there are almost no Africans, no really strong connections with this continent, and perhaps in somehow general underlying fear of the stranger, I sometimes feel overwhelmed by a combination of deep, deep melancholy and also anger. But when I think of my experience as a deeply spoiled museum kid, playing in the stores of my father's museum in the Netherlands when I was small, the smell of a medieval ship, playing with 18th century dollhouses. Yes, I was able to do this. Today that would be impossible. And just simply sitting in the stores, I realize how much myself I am the pure product of museums, and how deeply I love those museums, and how they built my life, and how through objects they made me curious about other cultures, habits and worldviews. So how to deal with this phantom? How to deal with our tsukumogami? Is this unease equally generated in Paris, London, Berlin, Dresden and Herrnhut? Or are there local specificities and social-political context that may explain regional difference within the European area? Who is speaking and to whom? In Paris, in Berlin, in Dresden? What time is it in all those places? According to Fabian, Johannes Fabian, in anthropological writing, anthropologists and interlocutors do not appear as partners in dialogue. Instead of acting as equal speakers, the people of the other culture become the other of the anthropologist, spatially and temporally, different from him, her. In different ways, anthropological discourse relegates their other to other times. This is what we are still doing in museums, where the differentiation remains between the curator and visitor's time, modern, moving time, and the time of the so-called other, static and glass-boxed. As long as their time is not our time, as long as our time remains in the center of the museum discourse, as long as the voices of the people where the objects come from aren't really hearable inside the museum space, as long as the dominance of the monocultural Western perspective remains in museums, and I would like to thank the organizers of this symposium, and particularly Florence Tourmes, to have cared for that this symposium is a little bit more plural than usual. As long as local explanations of objects aren't told to the public, and I insist, stories told without the explicit translation of the European curator, the system of coloniality will last inside the museum. So we urgently need a museum with a plurality of stories, voices and views. This means working today on a daily basis with people from those countries in the museum and rethinking our institution together, which is underlined also by ROXLEY FOLEY. Breaking the European or Western worldview is highlighting a multi-perspectivity of histories through integrating local histories, local stories from elsewhere on globalization and encounters everywhere in the museum and on every level regarding to our changing society and multiplication of information flows. Won't it be necessary to adapt itself and giving place for subjectivity by integrating personal stories and interpretations inside the museum discourse, and so giving place for plurality and thus also conflicts and disagreement. Tonight you will see in our experimental step-by-step exhibition, Prologue 1 till 10, Stories of People, Things and Places, our last installation, the so-called Prologue 10, Last Minute. We've invited a performance artist from Kinshasa, Edi Ekete, tu es là, je parle de toi, mais tu parles pas anglais, who wanted to react on the German current debate on the colonial German past in Germany, and why this is closely connected with the Ethnographic Museum. We just open the doors and give him space for expression without intervening, without controlling. Would this mean this so-called hospitality of we spoke yesterday, giving hospitality also to disagreements? The museum as the so-called contact zone leads to an interaction between objects, the people from the countries where the objects are coming from, the curators and the audience, which also entails an enormous variety of interpretations, and where every museum, whether it is in Paris, here or in Herrnhut, will tell a different story. What is lacking in our museum is fundamentally interdisciplinary cross-cultural debate. A debate that may also be, or even needs to be, conflicting at times, as James Clifford suggested when introducing his notion of the contact zone. So let's invent a museum of chaos. Yeah, I like chaos, I must admit. A museum of rhizomes, rootstocks, as Édouard Glissant, French Caribbean writer and poet, has put forward. A museum which blurs its own borders of disciplines, borders of genre, borders of categories, borders of time, borders of aesthetics. So what could be that post-museum? I've robbed this word from Siraj. The post-museum would then be a place, a real place of conversation. We need the active and inclusive participation of the artists, scholars, theatre makers, spirituals, activists, writers, and other representatives from the countries of origin from which the so-called ethnographic objects are derived. The aim of this new kind of cooperation is to deal critically with the museum together, with these actors, in order to radically rethink and implement museum theories and practices. This will enable us to implement institutionally profound and ongoing reinvention. New kind of flexible and fluid exhibition displays has to be conceived, enabling the museum to react and to include stories, visions and approaches from everywhere. So we have to decenter those structures. Decentering means decentering the structure of knowledge, decentering expertise, multiplying knowledge. Decentering means decentering the museum structure, changing the way of decision making, permanently including pluralist views from outside the museum, rethinking the structure of departments, intermingling and tangling. Not only regional departments are departed, but also the store, the office, the library, the exhibitions, space for children. Decentering means decentering the structure of museology, disrupting linearity of narrative, history and time, rethinking contextualization, rethinking new ways of transmission in the museum, rethinking hospitality. Decentering means decentering the collection, rethinking ownership, sharing the collection, immaterial and material restitution, permanent loans, rethinking Provenienzforschung and how to make those results accessible to all, rethinking classification systems. I would like to have the next slide. Prologue, the exhibition you could see tonight in the Japanese palace, just on the other side of the Elbe, at the periphery, actually, is an experimental, fluid exhibition, a step-by-step exhibition. The exhibition structure is a labyrinth of thoughts and attempts. Interactivity, flexibility, fluidity, no linearity design are the ingredients of this exhibition, an exhibition of rhizomes. This prologue exhibition is a research for something, but we don't know yet the result. It is the road, but not the final destination. So prologue is a method. Prologue is a tool. Next slide, please. Every month, we opened a new installation, which was added to the former. When we inaugurated in December 2006, in an empty gallery space, we showed 12 whispering boxes, closed crates where you can just listen to objects, the biography of objects, an object which become an actor, an active actor. Every month we've added new stories, stories about our stores, next slide please, collectors, anonymity of the makers of those objects, stories about classification, next slide please, in our taxonomia books. We've rebuilt a living room where refugees show their observations of Saxonian rituals and behaviors. Next slide please. Tonight it's a last-minute installation, and this attempt is to try to introduce current debates in the exhibition and giving space to guests. Eddie Ekete. This fluid and flexible design gives us the opportunity to change anything we want and introduce new stories, new thoughts. It is designed as such that external people could participate, intervene, and tell their own stories. Next slide, please. We are just at the beginning of this experiment. We've made our psychanalysis, by definition unfinished, of our institution and collection. It's now time that others come and intervene, disturb and transform. New stories, objects and views can be added as the structure is based on modularity. Next slide, please. Prologue is never ending. Prologue is a living being, an animated living object. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yes. So my museum is a museum, our museum, my museum, your museum maybe, is a museum with a collection of tsukumogami, animated objects which run, sleep, react, fight, cry and laugh. But we are linked to each other, and we have to deal with those, like a family. This all in an unfinished palace, the Japanese palace at the other side of the Alps, the ideal place for experiments. By doing this all, by redesigning the museum, redefining its deep structures, we should not be afraid to get the baby thrown out with the bathwater. Partaking the objects, sharing their history, multiplying the modalities of knowledge production will not have as consequence to weaken our positions as a humanist and encyclopedic center. Nevertheless, in a crucial period where Europe is abandoning its central position as an economic metropolis, the ancient colonial center become itself more and more a periphery. Our old continent should stay aware and confident of its own traditions of savoir-faire when it comes to cultural and arts, and not only in an hegemonic way, also in its talent to invent new collaborative devices, so that the Encyclopedic Museum finally also become of their time. You are welcome tonight after the talks with objects at 7 p.m. and the performance of Eddie Ekete. This performance is called Pre-Wash, Wash, Drying, Purification, which will start at 8 in the evening, which will take place in the courtyard of the palace. There is wine and cheese next to the exhibition space, and you're all welcome. Thank you very much.
So one more speaker and then we'll gather. George, OKELLO, ABUNGU. I should say that George came up to me and said, I have 30 minutes, right? And I said, well, no, actually 15. He said, well, 22. I said, no, 15. He said, well, 18 to 20. So George, over to you.
Before I go there, he's told you his story. We did that. But now the question is, you and the audience to give me 2 more minutes. Okay. If I was an object in an encyclopedic with my baggage from Kenya, so my leather shoes are in the baggage. So I'm wearing what I was wearing in the plane, which is the truth, but I'm feeling very okay with it. But if I was outside there, and you give me a bicycle and I'm riding in town, and someone says, do you know that design of fashion clothes? And the kids and everybody sees, and they see me walking on a black, suit and the sneakers. They say, oh yes, we know him. That guy is very famous. So it depends on your own context and where you come from. So how can we have a universal museum that tell all these stories? Or encyclopedic museum that can tell us all these stories? That I begin basically by sort of challenging the whole concept. My only other fear is that this platform here is absolutely contagious when it comes to getting addicted to talking to people rather than talking with people. Because sometimes it becomes like a place of performance. And my fear, Marion, is that I hope that we are not here to perform, and once we have left, you have nothing remaining. And I want to thank you and the people, your people, you've done a fantastic thing. But at the same time, I want to say that you have touched a very tricky and very sensitive subject in terms of dealing with the question of universal museum or encyclopedic. It depends on what you want to call it. Because it is tricky, because it is a subject that has been contested, that has been maligned. Why? Because when the whole concept of universal museum came in, it started from Europe, the so-called center of culture and civilization. And the interest and the intention was not to represent the world. It was to protect the interest of the major museums. And I'm not going to go beyond that. You can read what I have talked or written about Universal Museum. I think that was in 2008. I was one of the people who is responsible for saying no. And up to now, I do not believe in the word Universal Museum. Let me start by saying that. Maybe you can convince me in terms of encyclopedic, but if it is not a baptism of universal, because I think it started on the wrong side. So very quickly, because I know when you give the last talk, it's like keeping the audience captive. Please, you are welcome to doze off and sleep. When I finish, I'll let you know. Because I know you are tired. So you can sleep. I will not mind if you sleep, whatever you do. But I have to take my time. I've traveled from very far, all the way from Kenya, and I want to talk to you. And I want to start by saying that museums, maybe I can put this off. Museums have come a long way. They have come a long way from cabins of curiosities to become basically facilities, organizations, organs of education, discovery, entertainment, of research. They are holders of history and places of dialogue, national prestige, and even identities. They influence us. They are not only powerful spaces of human interaction and enjoyment, but they can influence people's thinking and attitude. And because of that, they could also be very vulnerable to misuse in terms of being portrayed or portraying imagined hierarchical differences between peoples, and we've heard about that. Today, museums, including in Europe, are revisiting their role in the age of great challenges. They are starting to ask difficult questions on how they can best serve a fluid and constantly changing audiences. Changing audiences, population, that change due to different factors, including immigration that has been mentioned, population that is not only young and impatient, influenced by the new technology and constantly on social media, but also parents and other audiences, some of whom have been traumatized by wars and have come to Europe, uprooted from their spaces, the spaces that they know. The question is, what is the role of museums in the resettlement and stabilization of such groups? Because I think that we need to ask ourselves hard questions. We can come here and talk of the beautiful of museums and how they are great. How wonderful we have done. And forget that we have a role. We have roles. A roles that takes them away from grouping people without sacrificing the diversified identities of us all. Our differences in unity. A role that appreciates differences without creating hierarchical orders. A role that does not involve patronization, but does justice to the sense of belonging at all times. In Africa, for example, we've had a history of colonization, and it's been said, and I think we are now saturated with the word colonization. The call has not only been to decolonize the museum in the post-colonial period, but also to democratize it. However, museums their practice and their historical journey remains problematic, and the expectations for decolonization is fast fading. These alone may render museums irrelevant at best and offensive at worst. Is it possible to decolonize museums even in the West? That is a question. Is it possible? And why decolonize? I think we have reasons. And the reasons include because colonialism was all about inequality, it was about domination and discrimination. And the museums, especially in the developing world, were intimately and historically tied to colonialism. And some of that element still persists to today. But the other thing is that museums, as we know them, are captives of their own past practices, especially their treatment of collections as sacred objects. Once collected, by whatever means, the collection becomes a sacred, untouchable, supreme, to the extent that their disposal, return to the sources, become unimaginable. These collections that represent footprints of the various cultures and heritages of the different parts of the continents. But nobody can underestimate the role of museums. However, as much as these are virtues of the museum, for example, representation, enlightenment, education of human communities, it is also known that due to their checkered history, museums are never innocent. That's why sometimes when I hear about innocent museums doing the most fantastic things, I get worried. The narratives are often coined in material culture called collections. The collections make museum and the difficulty of imagining the loss of those collections create ripples which are unimaginable in museum setting. It is not really sometimes the representation that matters, and this is what I think, but sometimes the quantity. If you hear of the numbers of material that we have found in museums, it shows you the natural greed, the exploitative, opportunistic, and open competition attitude that the museum has developed over the years, particularly in the West. And I think we need to be truthful with ourselves. The concept of unique, the concept of only one or one of their type has been manipulated by some collectors to make the museums become captives. So we are always on the lookout. What is new? What is there that we can get that makes us different from the others? And of course it comes with these problems. Under these circumstances, any change in attitude towards collection that may lead to flexibility in their treatment or their disposal through destruction, which for me is possible, return, or any other means is construed as a potent demise of the museum. And the curators will be willing to protect that with their blood. We know that museums tell stories over space and time. They can inspire, they can also challenge. They are powerful instruments of control and dissemination of knowledge. They are capable of changing not only perception, but lives. Therefore, they should be treated with care. They are supposed to help collective memory of nations and peoples. People believe in what they see in museums. And so they are powerful instruments even of manipulation. The question that comes to me all the time is why decolonize museums, especially from my perspective as an African. Museums are about imagining the past and creating the present. They exert powerful influences on us and our perceptions about others and ourselves. So my question is, what stops us from thinking that it is okay for museums, in the West in particular, to continue to hold bodies brought from Africa or other developing countries? Our Australian folks did talk about that, for experiments, and is still held in their vaults. What makes us think it is okay? What stops us from thinking that it is okay for museums to hold, keep, and display non-provenance collections with non-suspect sources and means of accusation, while everybody disapproves or pretends to disapprove of the same? What stops us from thinking it is okay for the so-called great museums or universal or whatever they are of the world to keep silent in the face of destruction, loss, and illicit traffic of cultural property, especially from bleeding continents like Africa? We know what takes place in Mali, in the whole of West Africa, with the wars there. It is the cultural material, the drugs, and the guns that follow the same route. But if you ask those people who are in charge of security, they will tell you, if we open the vehicle and there is no drug and there's no gun, we'll tell them to pass, because material culture does not concern us. In many museums today, universal museums or encyclopedic museums, the narratives told are often about us and them. Of course, the interpretation, the curators do not necessarily listen to the owners of the object because they are out. And we know the appropriation of the responsibility to have the sole control of the interpretation on behalf by the curators, of course, provides undue power that often is misused or used to create marginalized or even belittle others. For example, classification, and I think Siraj talked about that. Some of the people who have looked into this issue have referred to it as othering the people, the others. For example, Legutko, Kathleen, talking about decolonization of museums, points out the way we classify things, particularly in natural museums, the whole of the African peoples, the whole of the North American Indians, And Amilonetri has actually observed very rightly when she says museums can be very painful sites for native peoples as they are intimately tied to colonial processes. So I think that the first thing that we need to understand is that narratives in museums, including in the West, have always been meant, and we need to deconstruct that, to restate, reinforce, and reaffirm relations of inequality and dominance. So that dominant colonial narratives of pioneering work of discovery, of civilizing the other parts of the world, still prevail today. And of course, as already been said, museums have their origins in Europe, starting as temples of art and culture, and bringing this idea, which I have had a little bit, that Europe occupies the center stage of world culture and human civilization. My question is, how does the so-called Encyclopedic Museum or Universal Museum intend to avoid making this mistake of centering Europe as the yardstick of great civilization, great achievements that the world needs to look to? Without making Europe appear to be trying to recolonize using the mind and the narratives rather than the space and the people. I think that we need to revisit our thinking, the way we do things. I think that we need to understand the museum story is checkered. We refuse to deal with the checkered past of injustices, and instead we spend all the time developing narratives of normalcy. We are trying to sanitize the wrong sometimes. We refuse to disengage from the continuation of the ruthless exploitation of the heritage of the other. We refuse to open up the closet of human remains and release the confined spirits of the ancestors. We refuse to reconsider any discussion that would question the integrity of our collections. We refuse to dialogue with the past, hoping that the memory of the past will disappear, leaving objects that we can manipulate and reinterpret in a way that would suit our imagined present. Who does not know that many of the collections in many of our museums have origins in war spoils? Whether it was Africa, Europe, that some of them have in illicit collections, including illicit trafficking, inappropriate archaeological collections, diggings in Mali and other places, at the expense of some societies that continue to pain and shame, and we heard about it. It is no longer a question of overdwelling or overemphasizing same issues all the time. Nobody expects museums to be completely innocent. Nobody expects collections, all collections, to have provenance. The issue is how museums have and continue to react to these questions and to carry out their work, often in secrecy, hoping that communities and the world will develop some mental amnesia. We continue to engage on sanitizing the absurd sometimes. I still have a few questions. How much of this has changed? How much of the imbalance in terms of narratives have changed despite rhetoric decolonizing museum in post-colonial setting? We still see museums that continue to hold very dearly on collections and exhibitions that obviously show discrimination and inequality because they fear destabilizing the system You don't want to change anything. But I want to also agree that in the West and also in other parts of the world, the museums indeed have contributed to world knowledge, to research. But at the same time, there is need to accept the truth that we still have some agenda to deal with. We need to ask ourselves, when we are looking at our collections, these sacred collections, are these the same collections or part of that will create encyclopedic museums in question, if these collections have questions about them? Are the museums willing to disclose and display their provenance and under what conditions these collections were collected? Is this kind of transparency not the requirement for a move forward? I feel that as long as museums avoid tackling the tough questions that will liberate them from this self-inflicted, self-conceived, and self-made guilt, they will always be surrounded by controversy and contradictions. We have moved to some extent, although we are still moving between the two, from the concept of universal museum to now encyclopedic museum. My only wonder, is this a baptism or is this a true transformation? I think if it is going to be true transformation, then we need transparent and accountable ways in which we do our things. That is the only way that will move forward. Of course, many, including formerly colonized worlds, have had no problems whatsoever with organizations calling themselves whatever they want to call. I have no problem, whatever name we want to put up. The only problem is when these organizations, including museums, claim moral authority to unilaterally represent us without our free and unqualified consent and endorsement, on the basis that they are better off taking care of and interpreting our heritage on their own term. I have heard today a number of times when people say, we are willing to give back material, but only if we can know that the people we are giving back this material are ready for it and can show that. Who has given you that authority in the first place? Who are you talking as? Are you talking about someone's own material, some of it sacred, some of it human remains? Who has given you the authority to determine, and what criteria is going to form the proper? This is the language I was saying that we need to move away from. Because if we do not, we continue engaging in this dialogue of contradictions. Many points of view have always been to stress respect. And I'm talking here also as someone who has been engaged in this. Nobody expects transfer of material from the north to the south. But many have always stressed the idea of respect through negotiation and dialogue when it comes to museum collections. When it comes to questions of ownership and use, return this whole issue that we are mesmerized with, except for negotiated items, for the sacred items, as well as for human remains. I don't think anybody is asking for mass repatriation. So I think that the silences, the arrogance, and the reinvention of roles that claim to represent whole humanity needs to be questioned, interrogated, and we need to know that we are on the right way. I want to thank SKD and the Director General again, I was very happy to read that you actually pride yourself for benefiting from 500 years of collecting art objects, scientific instruments and apparatus, precious books and rare objects. It left me wondering whether you also have human remains. So today when the minister was saying that you are willing and ready to return the human remains, I said, but they are not listed in these 500 years of collecting, unless they are also the objects. I think this is by all means an extremely impressive track record and a dedication to the promotion of knowledge and science, and I want to congratulate you for that. However, I also want to give you a few questions. How much resources have been placed on what the 500 years of collecting of the museum objects mean to both the German audiences as well as to those whose material culture are part of this collection? Under what conditions were these collections made within and outside Germany? Are all these collections of provenance, and if not, what is being done in relation to the ones without? How does this heritage unite or divide? How does it mold or destroy relations? How does this heritage empower or disempower? In the long term, how is this heritage relevant to all beyond the borders of Dresden and Germany in this complex world of migration and cultural mix? Can this heritage or collection be considered part of the symbol of the dominant and dominating culture and systems that continue to control and entrench the politics of inequality? And if that is the case, how does the museum intend to correct the same? How, this is to everybody, can we or one blame colonialism in a platform like this, while at the same time benefiting from its past history of looting and destruction by keeping it and not talking about it? Illicit trafficking, for example, in cultural products, including illegal excavation and destruction of sites, memory and history, continues today because there's demand of it, particularly in the West. It is a one-way traffic from south to north. And while not all museums are engaged in the buying of illicit gotten cultural materials, if museums did not need and get the same, there would be very little business for dealers. So at the end of the day, the way of doing things, including conceptualizing museums, developing narratives, and exhibiting, including exhibiting the others, must be deconstructed and reconstructed anew. I think that all of us need to be involved. And for me, the saying, not for me without me,
encyclopedic, stewardship, chronology. These were words that came up more than once, sometimes 3 or 4 times, as you were negotiating your way through your position. And there were differences. So I'm wondering if any of you want to ask another of your fellow panelists a question.
I have a question concerning the term encyclopedic. Encyclopedic, encyclos means the whole circle. But somehow we are only the half circle here, because the natural sciences and the natural history museums are missing. And we do behave as if the history of Earth only would be made by humans. So we are talking about Western centrism, Eurocentrism, a little bit about Sinocentrism, but we do not talk about anthropocentrism. And I think we should overcome that, because we are living in a world where we experience every day the interrelation between our natural environment and us. And even man-made, so-called man-made centuries like the 18th century can also be narrated as centuries of the expansion of the Norway rat, or the expansion of the magnet, or even if you think in the 16th century, 19% of the Indian population in Mesoamerica was killed not by humans but by microbes. And I think this would be the next step with overcoming centrisms. So this is something I was reflecting.
Anybody want to respond to that notion of the encyclopedic?
I just briefly want to say that, I mean, part of the problem of this concept is that, I mean, quite frankly, the Natural History Museum is a cultural history museum in a very profound sense. And I was very excited when the first announcement of this symposium came out, with the idea possibly that Mark Dion would be able to engage these kinds of questions of the cultural construction of nature. And I think that should be the starting point from which we engage that question.
Thank you. Yeah, 2 things, anthropocentrism and encyclopedia. I think the point is very well taken about this nature-culture divide, which is a sort of modernist ontology. And there are, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to this argument that we need a concept of culture that's more expansive, that looks at culture as being co-produced by human and non-human. The problem, the methodological problem about theorizing or getting away from an anthropocentric point of view is that all that we do, the objects that we have in the museum, the language that we use, the concepts, these are all, they're filtered through human. They are basically anthropocentric. So we try and overcome anthropocentrism, and yet we remain trapped in that. So that's a methodological dilemma, and I think, but it's important to engage with it. The point about the encyclopedia, and this came up also in the earlier discussion. Well, the way I see it is that words are not static. Concepts are not static. They can't be reduced to, say, their original lexical values. So you can look at, the root of the word, the encyclopedia, but then it grows, it's been used in different contexts. Let's talk a bit about the history of this encyclopedic museum, why this thing became important. Now, the museum, the Encyclopedic Museum, was created at the moment, and this came up also as the transformation from societies, aristocratic privilege into democratic societies. That was the moment also of the birth of the museum. It's the birth of democracy. What was that democracy? That it was a democracy that was based both on inclusion and exclusion. It was a democracy that destroyed aristocratic privilege. It gave democratic rights to bourgeois men. Okay, it excluded, at the moment when these museums were created, there was also an exclusive form of democracy, excluded all women, it excluded people of the working class, it excluded the members of the colony. Okay, so this is, and the museum, so it was, because it was a democracy that was based on the principle that citizenship is not a right of birth. Citizenship, the entitlement to citizenship is only for those people who are capable, are competent to exercise that citizenship. So, you know, and this is the concept which is coined by Dipesh Chakravarti, called pedagogical citizenship. Okay, this encyclopedic museum is born at that moment where institutions like the archives, the museums, were intended to actually enable citizens to exercise their rights of citizenship in a more responsible way. They're supposed to be able to think rationally, to be able to distinguish, to be able to categorize. So in a sense, the term encyclopedic is really also coded through this moment of a particular kind of democracy. What happens over the 19th and the 20th century, and this is, you know, you can see the transition where democracy, citizenship also becomes performative. It's coming from below. Okay, so this is a model of citizenship from above, and there's a citizenship from below. Those who are denied their rights are now claiming it. Okay, so you have women asking for suffrage. You have the colonies claiming independence. Migrants in Western societies are creating their own sites of memory through museums of migration. Okay, the wonderful museum you mentioned in the District 6 Museum is also an example of this, the citizenship from below. So the question then is, this term encyclopedic, if we want to use it today, do we want to, like as we talked about universal, do we want to make it, you know, give it another kind of meaning that makes it relevant to our times? I think that's the kind of question then. So sorry for that.
I just wanted to quickly touch on the different definitions of colonization, and I think it's really highly important to highlight the fact that in the Australian context, we didn't have treaties like New Zealand, Canada and America. We never had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission like South Africa did. We have no Native American museums and control of our cultural narratives, that we're very much in a disempowered position here. So the only times we've had any advancement have been with the help of the international community and the founding of our health and legal services and things like this. So, and we never managed to kick out the British like the India did either. So we're very much in a different situation here. But yeah.
Yeah, just very quickly, I'm involved with a program that is it's called Linking Nature and Culture. And this is really from an international level of UNESCO. And of course, when you're conversant with the UNESCO conventions and governments and the way they do things, you can see the top-down kind of stuff. Because they've realized that nature and culture has always been separated. But they realize that there's so much difficulty. It's like separating tangible and intangible. Yet the tangible is given meaning by the intangible. Now, how do you separate nature from culture? And I think this is a question that the museum still need to revisit. I think we are looking at museums as if they are static entities with one definition. There are many types of museums also. And I don't think that museum is something that, you know, what about museums of stamps or museums of toenails or museums of whatever? There are so many different types of museums, and I think we need to consider that when we are discussing this concept and the fact that it is an evolving process. The third thing, I think that the question of nature and culture is embedded in historical discrimination, in the fact that nature, particularly people from the south, you know, the colonized, were supposed to be living in nature. So nature has always been associated with while the others were much more cultural. Europe was cultural, Africa and other places were living in nature. So there has been this fear, even within the museum itself, how to deal with this question of bringing this together, so that, you know, you fear, how, if we bring this together, how do we amalgamate it? The last one is the question of democracy, and I think you've given us a very good background on this. But I have a problem with this word democracy, because we are speaking the same language that has made it very difficult for us to define what we are talking about. English, Western, European. We are using the same language to try to change something that is embedded in the same language. We have to develop another language. So we are using the same terminologies. How are you going to move away from it when we continue to, the language is constructed in the West and we just inherit it and use it? So I think it is very important. For Africa, someone like Julius Nyerere, the first president of Tanzania, he said, we don't want Western democracy. We were more democratic before the Europeans came. Because as Africans, when we disagreed on something, we sat under the tree, talked until we agreed. And we all agreed, and then we went and did it. There was nothing like, carry up your hand, do this. No, no, we just talked. And you can talk, and when people get tired, they'll say, okay, I think the best way to go about is this. That is democracy. Everybody agrees with it. How do you bring that into the discussion that we are having? So sometimes I think we also need to look at the local context, which creates the international context. But sometimes I think that we are so much driven by what we have inherited, to the extent that it's so difficult for us to disengage ourselves from that language and those practices and those narratives and the way we've been made to think. So we have a problem. There are more problems than what we think.
James?
It's funny, we don't have a problem, we have an opportunity. And it's interesting that in these discussions yesterday and today and continuing tomorrow, we're opening a door for conversations that most of us have never had together. And I don't want it, coming back to your question about the embrace of nature in this discussion, in a way it needs to be one step at a time, because there's a kind of waiting here, E-I-G-H-T-I-N-G, here, that relates to those of us who focus on objects of material culture. So that limits the platform for the moment, but it starts discussions in a way that is different from how these discussions have happened in the past. You know, no one has made us pause to talk about local and global. That one is over. We've all absorbed that. That's now part of the conversation in our discussions of the narratives for material culture. So I think it's more a question of stepping out, realizing that we're stepping out, and thinking of how to have these conversations, and then growing them. But you need to formalize one platform before you get to the next. That's one thing that I wanted to say. And you know, you listed terms that we used, and there's a term that we haven't used yet, I don't think, in anyone's presentation, which is about passion for how we look at what we look at, and what it is, you know, these objects of material culture are not just things on a chessboard. And you know, we've gotten to connecting them, and we started to talk about contextualizing them. We actually didn't yet get to how it's a two-way street. It's not that the connection is just from here to there, it's a resonance from here to there and back. But the next thing, and I think it should come in even at this stage in the discussion, is about our passion for what we hope to get out of these interpretations in museum settings.
I'm not sure what James meant when he said we're done with the local and the global, but I'll talk to you about that over a drink. Did you want it?
Ich wollte sagen, dass der Naturbegriff in den Anthropologien bis hin zu der enzyklopädischen Anthropologie des 18. Jahrhunderts immer verbunden war und dass in den Schöpfungsmythen vieler Kulturen das ja ein Verhältnis ist, dass die Menschen geschaffen sind unter den verschiedensten Modellen dass sie befähigt werden in besonderer Weise, unterschieden werden von anderen Lebensweisen. Und dann kommt sowohl in der hebräischen Bibel als in der christlichen Genesis und in vielen anderen Schriften ein Spezifikum heraus, dass die Natur zu bearbeiten sei, sodass die Frage des Verhältnisses von Mensch und Natur wesentlich eines der Bearbeitung ist, oder wie Luther übersetzt und schon die Vulgata im Mittelalter, dass der Mensch die Erde untertan machen soll. Und dadurch kommt eine Spaltung hinein, dass man immer weiß, dass der Mensch ein Naturwesen ist, in der Natur, aber dass der Mensch in der Natur ein Wesen ist, das die Natur beherrschen muss. Und da haben Sie ganz recht, dann sind die anderen Völker, sind die Völker, die nicht auf der Kulturstufe erwähnt werden, gedacht werden.
Langsamer sprechen, damit ich das später übersetze, weil jetzt ja kein Deutsch verstehen.
Oh no.
Sind viele, die nicht verstehen.
Ja, wird er besetzt.
So it's the end of the day, so I can tell you the following story, and I say it with great respect. I gave a talk once at the museum in Boston, and one of my 90-year-old trustees came up to me afterwards and said, "You were brilliant. It was fabulous. I couldn't hear a word you said." Okay, so I just want to say I apologize. I apologize. I know that we're just about out of time. We're probably out of time, but I want to ask George a question at my peril, because then people will want to respond. But you use the word accountable, and you said it with passion. Say a bit more about what we should be accountable for, and then I'm just curious whether anybody wants to respond.
Yes, I use the two words, accountable and transparent. I think sometimes we are not accountable in terms of the fact that we seem to operate on our own world. We are accountable to our own institutions and our own self and management. But we don't know that we are actually serving the communities outside there. We are using taxpayers' money. We need to be able to provide them with the information they need. They need to give us information, and we need to listen to them. We need to make things very clear. And accountable also in terms of the collections that we have. Why should we have collections in secrecy? Why don't we talk it out? Because in most cases, when you talk these things out, there may be a row, and after that, everything will cool down and people will move forward. But as long as we keep these secrets and keep them as sacred and we don't talk about them, they will always follow us. So I think we need to be accountable for our actions. We need to be accountable to the people who make us be in the business that we are in. We need to be accountable to the people whom we are giving the services. We are service providers, but we also need to get the feedback. We need to be able to engage everybody. So for me, those are parts of accountability in the side of the museum service providers.
Response, anybody?
I just want to add to that idea of accountability, that here we have the knowledge keepers and the storytellers of the world and of Europe. There is accountability to make sure that these stories are told. I could be going to the international courts and all of these criminal justice groups, but that's not going to get the message of what's needed for my people at home. We need the people who have the heart, have the ability to tell the messages and tell the story to help the world and the people understand what's happening. So, yeah.
We're just about done. I'm worried about using the word we or you, but I'm going to ask everybody on the panel if you want to say, I would like to say this before I step off the stage. Is there anything you want to say that you haven't said? I want to say this.
I want to thank the organizers of this meeting profusely, because I think that you've started something that was due. You have revisited a difficult field, a difficult subject, but I just want to say that I hope that you stand firm, truthful to your calling. which is to open up this discussion and hope that we can build on this to create a better museum system, a better museum and a better world where everybody, you know, looks at us in an open, transparent and accountable way.
Okay, so I was wrong. We didn't end up on a boat that sank. We ended up on a spaceship. And I just want to say thank you for ending on such a high note and with such clarity. Thank you all to the panelists, and we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Are we saying one last roundup thing, Marianne? Thank you, everybody.
First, I want to thank you, everybody here, especially Matthew, for this great moderation this whole day. And I felt very comfortable to stay in the role of a listener today, because I'm a little bit overwhelmed by all these passionate statements, and I think I can speak for the whole team and all the people who are here in this room. I promise, George, a true transformation. And it's the right moment for all of us. So we are deeply in discussions inside our teams. And it is so important what is happening in these days. It's not that every subject is new for us. We know all these questions, these different perspectives. But I think I don't know if one of my colleagues had a similar experience before, to have you all together in one room in this density. It was such a dense coming together of different perspectives today, and we need some time to think over it. I have some ideas how perhaps we could go on. So the one method is, of course, continue talking to each other, so the boys' concept of the permanent conference, which I really like. But we are always thinking in rooms and displays, and so we are people of the museums world. And I thought perhaps we could do something together to develop an experiment. Invite everybody who was part of this conference to try to show what he was speaking about in a certain form of stage, of display. For example, in the Japanese Palais, could be a space, a common space to try to develop models of how we could see the museums different. And so we have to think about it. I think we have to give us some time and reflect it. And we have another day tomorrow. And so yes, I'm very deeply happy and thankful for what happened today. Thank you so much. I used the moment I have the microphone because I have to give another announcement, because the day is not over, so it needs a high condition. But so many of our guests, they had a many hours flight to come to meet us, and so it's also a sense of respect that we have a big condition. And so the evening is going on, and I'm very happy that Katharina von ROXLEY, Kate, is now taking over. So at 7 o'clock at the Japanese Palais, she will doing something with us which is calling Talks with Objects. I don't think I have to explain it. No. And so we have to go now together to the Japanese Palais at 7 o'clock, the Talks with Objects, and then we can participate at NANETTE's opening of the prologue number 10. And tomorrow morning, because we are this museum, if we call it encyclopedic or not, but we have so many specialists among us, and this is also something very special, and I really like it. And we had the idea to give you special guides through our collection with our specialists. We have to get up a bit earlier tomorrow morning, so we start at 8:30. And the first, it's more like a speed guide. The first tour would be through Stefanie Buck in the exhibition Einzigartig, Unika und Seltenheiten, and you meet at the Kupferstichkabinett, so in the Residenzschloss. The second guide will be in the Albertinum. You meet in the Lichthof of the Albertinum and with Matthias Wagner and the team of the Albertinum. And the third one is Power and Fashion. It will be in the Rüstkammer and by Dr. Jutta van Bloo, who's a specialist on costumes. And so I give you advice to use the possibility to be guided by our wonderful colleagues, because you're here in Dresden, and it was one of the reasons we invited you, that we can show us all our wonderful collections. So thank you, and I wish you a nice evening.